Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Winston Wong. I am a family physician by training, but I'm more proudly now the CEO and chair of the National Council of Asian Pacific Islander Physicians. Our organization has been in existence for about 15 years, and we are an organization of networks of physicians across the country who are focused on providing care and access to Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian populations. We advocate for physicians to have a voice in improving the quality of care to those underserved communities across the Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian communities. So thank you for joining us. We've had a number of webinars in the past, but we're particularly proud today to present this webinar around the experience and history of Nikkei physicians during the World War II concentration internment camps in the United States. Forcibly detained, voluntarily professional, the story of Nikkei physicians. Before we get started on the program, I did want to provide you with a little bit of context as to how this webinar came to be. The National Council of Asian Pacific Islander Physicians um, has been involved over the last 2 years with the American Medical Association to identify the role of organized medicine in facilitating health equity or in some ways obstructing health equity. And I've been part of that process. We thank the AMA for showing its leadership and its responsibility to look at these issues historically. During the course of those 2 years, I, as representing the National Council of Asian Pacific Islander Physicians, did raise the issue of whether the AMA had ever looked at its position relative to Japanese Americans being interned in the concentration camps during World War II. And there was no clear recognition that this had happened. And I queried about what about the physicians that were Japanese American physicians during that time? What was their story? Everyone was really quite curious, but we didn't have many answers. And subsequently, I was very delighted to contact Gwenn Jensen, who you will hear later, as one of the co-authors of an important book that was published 20 years ago, which you'll hear about, Silent Scars of Healing Hands. And that opened up the door for us to think about why do we need to have a webinar like this, particularly as we celebrate Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. As you know, one of the objectives for API Heritage Month is to look at our history, but also learn from our history. And I can't think of a more important part of our Asian American history in terms of informing where we stand today as the medical community, as the broader community, as an immigrant community, and how we can identify where injustice was born by a community and how we are still susceptible to those injustices. Even today, as you know, there was an argument by the Trump administration to use the Alien Enemies Act as a basis to deport people. And that was the same act that was used to incarcerate Japanese Americans during World War II. Another aspect that I wanted to share with you was I did come across a survey that was conducted by the Asian American Foundation in the last year. And that survey revealed that 25% of the respondents to this survey perceive Chinese Americans as a threat to U.S. society. And even more relevant to this particular issue that we're dealing with today, less than one half of the respondents in that survey felt that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was unjustified. In other words, more than half of the individuals surveyed believe that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was justified. It's a sorry state of affairs in terms of where we are 80 years later, that there is prevalent sentiment with regards to issues of xenophobia and perceptions of people being aliens and not entitled to the full justices in civil rights as Americans and American citizens. So with that, I think it's really important for us to engage you and to turn to the lived experience and the biographies that have been collected with regards to this dark time in American history, but also highlight, underscore the heroism of the physicians that served and nurses that served our community during this dark time of incarceration of Japanese Americans. One last thing is I want to mention that the Japanese American Medical Association, which I think Dr. Kaji will reference, was the first medical association that really wanted to dig into this history, and thus the book that was published with Dr. Jensen is being one of the co-authors. And I want to salute the Japanese American Medical Association for making sure that we don't lose these stories to history. So thank you, JAMA. Not the Journal of American Medical Association, but the Japanese American Medical Association. And with that, I'd like to turn to Ignatius Bao, who will be our moderator for the next hour and highlight the remarks that Dr. Jensen and Dr. Kaji will provide. Ignatius?
Thank you, Dr. Wong, and welcome everybody. We really hope that this will be an interactive conversation. Our guests are going to share briefly, but we really welcome your questions in the Q&A because we want folks to weigh in. So I'm not going to take a long time introducing our two panelists. Dr. Gwenn Jensen, as you have heard, is an oral historian and medical anthropologist and has really broken the ground on collecting the histories, the oral histories, and lived experiences of many of the Japanese American physicians and others who were incarcerated during World War II and collected them in the book as well as in other writings that she has done. Dr. Troy Kaji is a recently retired family physician, medicine physician who worked in the Contra Costa Health System, but at a personal level comes from a rich family history as the grandson of Dr. Kikuwo Tashiro, who was a pioneer in the Los Angeles area as a physician, one of the co-founders of the Los Angeles Japanese Hospital, and went on to other leadership positions in the community. And Troy has also been collecting his own oral histories and talking to those who were in the incarceration camps and collecting his stories as well as the stories of his grandfather and those that his grandfather worked with. So I'm going to start with Dr. Kaji to just give us a little bit of context. Pre-1942, before World War II came to the shores of the United States with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and what it was like, the fact that there were many Japanese American physicians who were in practice, especially here in California, but were part of the Japanese American community in that context before the war broke out. Troy?
Hi, everyone. On May 9th, 1942, 83 years ago, my father's family boarded a train and arrived at Manzanar. What I'd like to do with my first part of this is give you a sense of the psychological state of things for the accounts that Gwenn Jensen is going to share. This period of December 7 until people were in the permanent detention centers, which were mostly inland. Starting hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the FBI arrested hundreds of first-generation or Issei Japanese American leaders in Hawaii and the West Coast, including leaders of two organizations, Japanese Medical Society, the forerunner to the Japanese American Medical Society, and the Los Angeles Japanese Hospital. One of these doctors, Rikita Honda, was arrested from his home, taken to the INS detention facility, Terminal Island, Long Beach. held in solitary confinement, interrogated, and on December 14, was found dead at the detention center hospital, having left this note on his office prescription pad. Quote, "A doctor's vocation is to save lives. In order to save lives, it is a doctor's highest honor to sacrifice himself. I dedicated myself to Japanese-American friendship. Now Japan and America are at war. I could not prevent it. I wish to make amends by taking my own life." This was reported on the December 16th issue of the Rafu Shimpo, along with 2 other first-generation people who took their lives. Other leaders who were arrested, and just imagine this is your medical community, included the leader of the hospital, Dr. Ejika Amano, Dr. Fusataro Nakaya, and Dr. Isami Sekiyama, some of the other founders of this hospital. They were taken and then sent by train on Christmas Day, which took 3 days to reach the Department of Justice detention facility in Fort Missoula, Montana. There, the doctors, they put Dr. Amano in charge of the detention center hospital, aided by his colleagues there. The Japanese American Medical Society met, designated gifts of money to each of the affected families, which is what you would do too. On December 21, the Los Angeles Japanese hospital staff pledged support for the national defense effort. Quote, "In answer to the call sent to them by the Civilian Defense Board, the Japanese hospital organized its staff of doctors for emergency work last week." Then they sent to Mayor Boron, Los Angeles Mayor Boron, sheriff, and the Civilian Defense Board a resolution that resolved that the Japanese Hospital of Los Angeles, which is fully equipped for medical, surgical, and x-ray services, and its complete staff of physicians cooperate with and offer their facilities and services to the city and county of Los Angeles for the provision and care of the sick and injured during this period of emergency. Skipping forward to February. Now we're out of December into February 19th. The hospital staff had a meeting. Things had developed. It looked like all the enemy alien first generation Issei could well be deported or detained. So they decided, and they would transfer leadership to the American-born Nisei physicians, who they assumed would be safe. As you know, February 19th was the exact day of an executive order. The record sort of fizzles out there because people start getting scattered. What happened between February and April, when everyone started getting stuck into these detention centers, was I only have in hindsight these letters exchanged between White Memorial Hospital, Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, and the Japanese American hospital staff leaders, that they were going to have an agreement where White Memorial leased the Japanese hospital for $300 a month and took care of it for the duration. So they were able to hold on to that asset. All the Japanese Americans were in some sort of detention facility by June 6th. Some of the leaders from the Japanese American hospital went to Santa Anita Detention Facility, converted racetrack. Imagine this. You get to take care of up to 18,700 people, about half of whom are living inside smelly horse stalls. One of them was Dr. Sakaya Shigekawa, as detailed in Gwenn's book. I'm quoting, "She was first dismissed from her OB residency in Los Angeles County General Hospital, then ordered into detention at Santa Anita Hospital, and assigned a horse stall to live in. Quote, I just didn't believe our government would do that. I was in camp, I felt very bitter about it. I was half the time crying and half the time resenting everything that was done. but she was assigned to show up in clinic. So she reported to clinic, quote, "I was so unhappy and I didn't know any of those doctors, so I'd sit there. I guess I was depressed and I thought, well, gee, if this is a life I have to lead, I'd rather be dead." The leader of the hospital was a Dr. Norman Kobayashi. You know, this is recounted by Dr. Shigekawa, by the way. You know, just learn to accept this and just go along with it because there's nothing you can do. So Shigekawa said, so I went along, then I started to see some patients. Then at least I could forget where I was, but I was very bitter. I'd see kids marching, waving the flag and all that. And I thought, what does that flag mean? It's just a rag. I used to feel so reverent when I saw the flag waving. And now I thought, well, it's just a symbol. And some of them didn't seem to appreciate what was done for them. And I told Dr. Kobayashi, gee, I don't think I like this. And Dr. Kobayashi said, well, remember, these people are going through this trauma just like you. And he told me, just be sympathetic with them and just listen and take care of them. Okay, last thing I'm going to say before we switch to Gwenn is they started April 2nd. On August, Dr. Norman Kobayashi presented how the hospital is functioning to an audience in the recreation hall at Santa Anita. According to the information received from official visitors on inspection tours, Santa Anita Center can justly lay claim to being the best equipped, organized, and administered hospital of all the centers. Unique also is the fact that our hospital has always functioned without a Caucasian administrator. Thanks to the teamwork and esprit de corps of a small but efficient staff. 200 sick and injured outpatients. No doctor has had a day off since the April 2nd. The physician's daily calls or daily schedule is 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a 24-hour duty every 5th day. I could say more, but I'll leave it at that. So this is a lead-in now to Gwenn from the early period into all of the interviews that she conducted. Gwenn, take it away.
Okay, David, how about the first slide? I have a couple slides to show that illustrate some of the doctors in there, what they did. You may not realize, but over 126,000 people of Japanese ancestry were imprisoned without due process during the World War II. That included nearly 6,000 babies born in captivity. Most people were incarcerated in the 10 permanent sites shown here, located in remote sections of the West and Arkansas. Next. Next slide. Crowded living conditions place people at risk for their health and their lives. As it was, 1,867 people died. That it wasn't more is a credit to the Nikkei, people of Japanese ancestry, physicians who worked under harsh and demeaning circumstances. Next slide. According to historian Louis Fizet, there were about 100 Nikkei doctors in the 10 camps, all of whom had gone to top-rated medical schools. The Silent Scars team obtained information on 23 physicians and medical students still alive who worked in the camps, including 5 of the 11 female doctors and 1 female medical student. Dermatologist Masako Kusayanagi, shown here with her husband, Dr. Goto, was one of them. 3 of the female doctors were sisters, all highly regarded. The oldest, Kazue Togasaki, ignored the army when setting up the clinic near San Francisco. Quote, "Rules? I'm not here for rules. I'm here to be a doctor," she said. Outside of pregnant women and mothers of babies or small children, no one had it harder in these concentration camps than the physicians. Everyone found themselves in substandard living conditions, from horse stalls in the temporary centers to poorly built barracks in the permanent camps. There were communal mess halls, latrines, showers, and laundries, which served, next slide, sorry, which served the population, including the physicians. Three main issues complicated and interfered with the Nikkei doctors' ability to work. One, a shortage of equipment and supplies. Two, racism. And three, a shortage of doctors to treat the population. In most of the temporary centers, the medical facilities were little more than clinics, offering only an aspirin at best. And none of the permanent camps were ready for the huge onslaught of people. When the physicians arrived, they found a severe lack of necessary equipment and supplies. The Army had not taken into account that most of the people in prison would be women and children and the elderly. That meant medicine for illnesses that affected older individuals, pediatric supplies, or OB/GYN materials, even sanitary pads, were not available in the early days. It took nearly 6 months for the 250-bed hospital at Manzanar to be completed. Meanwhile, newborn babies were put in cardboard boxes as there were no beds for them. Next slide. The largest camp, Tule Lake, had only a 50-bed barracks for a hospital at the beginning. Eventually, Heart Mountain and the others all had 150-bed hospitals. Heart Mountain's hospital eventually encompassed 17 barracks and served 130 outpatients a day. By the end of the war, Heart Mountain saw over 1,000 operations and 566 births. Next slide. This lack of planning led to challenges. In the first week at a temporary center near San Francisco, Dr. Kazuo Takasaki, excuse me, encountered a woman who was about to give birth, and there was no place set up. Togasaki ordered people to rip a door from one of the horse stalls and place it across a sink in the laundry. Then she had them collect newspapers to cover the door, and that is where the woman had her baby. Dr. Shihara found the same situation at a temporary center near Sacramento. He asked his brother to build a delivery table out of scrap lumber, as there was nothing. Fortunately, he had the foresight to bring it with him to the permanent camp, as there was none there either. While at another temporary center, Dr. Henry Sugiyama's sister was having complications with her pregnancy. Quote, "She had toxemia, elevated blood pressure, and swelling. I wanted to send her to the county hospital because she's toxic. If you don't do something, we're going to have trouble." The white administrator said, "You're going to Tule Lake in a few weeks, so why don't you bear with her?" I said, "I can't wait that long." But the administrator said, "Well, you just have to." So her baby died. Sugiyama said medicine and supplies, quote, "started to dribble in about 2 or 3 weeks because we made a screaming pitch at the medical director. When the chief medical officer told them they needed more than an army hospital, and how about an x-ray, he said, it's coming. Sadly, Dr. Sugiyama's mother became sick the first month in Tule Lake. He asked the CMO to transfer his mother for x-rays, but he refused, saying that x-ray equipment was on order. It was 4 months before it arrived, and at that point, it was too late for surgery. According to intern Max Suzuki, Dr. George Hashiba and Issei, the immigrant generation, a surgeon from Fresno, brought his own personal equipment. He brought a cystoscope, esophagus scope, and surgical tools. He also performed neurosurgery. He was not only a superb surgeon, but he was also an activist who fought for better medical conditions for his internee patients. The lack of equipment meant the doctors had to improvise. Tuberculosis was a problem in all of the camps. At Tule Lake, TB patients filled 2 wards. Dr. Shihara had tuberculosis himself, so he had no fears about working with the TB patients. When a pneumothorax procedure was needed, he found there was none. Quote, so I got 2 of those 1-liter IV bottles and put some tubes on them and built a gadget to shove the air into the chest. It was very simple, and we used that the whole time I was there. Hara and his colleagues lacked another piece of equipment. He said, quote, an old man had drunk too much, and as he went sliding down a hill on cardboard, his foot struck a stump and broke his hip. Dr. Hashiba looked at him and said, we need a drill. There was none in the surgical supply, so we went to the garage and asked them to loan us a drill. They gave us a hand drill. We cleaned it all up and sterilized it, and Dr. Hashiba used it and fixed the man's hip. Lack of blood for transfusions resulted in the death of one pregnant woman at Santa Anita. Even in the permanent centers, supplies for transfusions were limited. Not all blood types were available. Next slide. Long hours and poor working conditions were common throughout the incarceration. When he arrived at Tule Lake from the temporary camp, Dr. Henry Sugiyama worked 4 straight days with no time to even unpack. Sugiyama said, quote, days would go by before we could get some sleep. Even Hashiba, who was in his 60s, was making calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. Nikkei physicians treated everything from the mundane to the critical. Here, ENT Dr. Takahashi is treating a sty on a young boy. Since many Issei had minimal health care before the war, they had put off treatment. Dr. Sugiyama said, quote, hernia was a very common problem by the hundreds. They were using a truss. They came to the hospital for tonsillectomies, hemorrhoidectomies, and many non-acute type problems. We had a very busy clinic. Next slide. Tule Lake Chief Medical Officer Dr. Reese Petticore felt there were too many surgeries being done. Dr. Shihara said, quote, he used to say, any case that has to be operated on, you've got to let me see it first. Some of those were acute appendicitis. By the time he got to see him, he made it pretty late, which made it much worse. But nobody lost their life because of it. The doctors protested his orders, saying, quote, all the people who are going out of camp have to be in excellent physical condition, so they won't be a load on the community where they go. At Tule Lake Hospital, doctors were doing an average of 6 tonsillectomies an hour. Dr. Sugiyama witnessed an ENT doctor who was preparing to do a tonsillectomy on a patient who proceeded to pass out. Sugiyama said, quote, the man's on the floor, and the doctor told the anesthesiologist and the nurse, watch him. And he did the tonsillectomy. He finished it right there on the floor. At Amachi, 29-year-old Dr. Higashi was head of surgery, and he figured he had performed more than 500 operations in his 3 years there, and proud he never lost a patient. Having faced enrollment quotas when they applied to medical schools, Nikkei physicians did not escape racist treatment in the permanent camps. The War Relocation Authority, the WRA, was the agency created to run the camps, and it would not allow doctors of Japanese heritage to be in charge of the medical care in the permanent camps, as they had done in the temporary centers. Instead, the WRA put them under the supervision of Caucasian chief medical officers, many of whom were elderly and trained before the Flexner Report of 1910. Most were simply not of the caliber of the Nikkei physicians. This decision created tension and resentment and underscored the inherent racism pervasive throughout the incarceration. As it was, there were several work stoppages and walkouts by Nikkei medical staff due to racist policies and treatment. The WRA had a rule that no one of Japanese heritage could attend to a Caucasian. So when a heavy white teacher came in complaining of stomach pain, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Carson was the only one who could touch her. He diagnosed appendicitis and asked Dr. Shigehara to administer the anesthesia. Hara said, quote, "Normally a 15-minute surgery, the doctor couldn't find the appendix. And after an hour and a half, he finally asked Dr. Harada to assist. Why, sure, he said. So he went over there, put his fingers right in and pulled it right out. It turned out it was not her appendix after all, but Mittelschmerz. Racism followed the Nisei after they left camp for med school. Homer Yasui and another Nisei were invited to join a local medical fraternity. When this chapter was invited to join the national that didn't allow Japanese, Homer said he and his colleagues were asked to quit. They resigned and never became national fraternity men. It was the Alpha Kappa Kappa. As Homer said, they should have called it KKK, but they didn't. Shortage of healthcare professionals plagued the centers for the entire time they were occupied. Initially, physicians were sent along with their neighbors to various centers, which led to an uneven distribution of physicians and specialties throughout the centers. Problems arose before the WRA sorted things out. In 1943, when Mabel Olta's baby came a month early, she found there was only one obstetrician at Poston, the second largest of all the camps at nearly 18,000. The doc had just delivered 3 babies in a row and collapsed from exhaustion. After 27 hours of labor, Oda's baby began to exhibit fetal distress. The doctor was called, but he said, quote, you should have a C-section, but there is no anesthesiologist. I'll have to use forceps. He struggled to deliver the baby, and then she was rushed to an incubator. Whether from the obvious damage caused by the forceps or lack of oxygen or both, Mabel's child had irrevocable brain damage that lasted her lifetime. Starting in the spring of 1943, a loyalty questionnaire was administered to all prisoners. When the administration concluded that some people could relocate to the interior, some Nikkei physicians, left for hospitals in the Midwest and East, where they were welcomed with open arms in areas where the draft had left communities short. But this exodus left the permanent detention centers understaffed again. People who answered to no to questions on the questionnaire were deemed disloyal and were sent to Tule Lake. And those at Tule Lake who answered yes, were sent to other camps. Dr. Hashiba decided to remain in Tule Lake and stayed there until the very end. Next slide. Dr. Sugiyama wanted to stay at Tule Lake also because he said medicine would be a lot more interesting as we were crowded. But then they told him, you can't stay because you're a yes, and if the no people ever get you alone someplace, they're going to beat you to death. So they moved he and his family to Topaz in Utah, where they stayed until it closed. Next slide. Doctors had to cope with issues caused by poorly prepared food and diets inadequate for diabetics or those suffering from kidney disease, and several people died because of it. With all of the dysentery, people began to think they were being poisoned by the government. It fell to the doctors to reassure them that no, it was just food poisoning from improperly stored or prepared food. Next slide. Environmental issues led to illnesses among both prisoners and staff. Dust was a problem at all of the camps except the 2 in Arkansas built on swampland. Dust caused respiratory problems. In particular, cases of asthma increased. Dusty conditions at Gila River in Arizona gave rise to multiple cases of coccidiomycosis or valley fever, where the fungal spores were endemic in the soil. Orderly Kawakami caught the mild form, which affected his knee joints, but others were not so fortunate and died. Next slide. Had it not been for the dedication and expertise of the Nikkei physicians, this unprecedented and unconstitutional incarceration would have been an unmitigated healthcare disaster. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gwen. And I would encourage everybody to type in any questions or comments you have in the Q&A, but we'll go back to Choi for some closing remarks of sort of the aftermath of the incarceration.
I'm going to switch back to Dr. Norman Kobayashi, who was fortunately recorded in 1974. After the war, they went back to Los Angeles and spoke to the Seventh-day Adventists who had been taking care of their hospital. And according to him, quote, "I don't think they expected us to come back. The original equipment in the hospital, they donated to a hospital and clinics in Mexico. But after a while, I think we finally had it returned to us. Then they used that old hospital for a while, being hazard, and they had to plan to get out of it. But at least they did have it for a while. In May 1946 is when the Seventh-day Adventists at White Memorial Hospital transferred the hospital back to the Japanese American physicians and staff. I want to call them out for this deed of keeping a trust and fulfilling it. However, one of the realities of coming back was, meanwhile, the community had been scattered across the country. Think of all of you who went through the COVID pandemic lately. How was your staffing after that? There was a shortage of returnee nursing staff again, because many of them had settled in the Midwest and the East Coast. And so the doctors, including my grandfather, were searching for returning nurses among those coming back. He would go to the train station and see who would come every day. He found a nurse, Ai Hanabusa, who had worked at the hospital before the war, was a well-trained nurse, and had worked for several years in 2 hospitals in Los Angeles. As soon as she got off the train, my grandfather asked her back to work at the hospital. When she got there, there were 6 patients with only 2 nurses. And she recalled grabbing her nurse's uniform and shoes and hurrying off to the hospital. So it was yet another crisis period. The return, the reentry. Okay, finally, the last story. On April 15, 1947, the Los Angeles Japanese Physicians Association reconvened and adopted a new name, the Japanese American Medical Association, JAMA, of Southern California. Re-elected new officers, including Nisei physician Norman Kobayashi. He was vice president, and Issei, Dr. Nakagi, was president. There was secretary, et cetera, et cetera. So that brings it back full circle to reestablishing a Japanese American Medical Association, who years later in 2002, I'm not sure, Gwenn was there, they asked, Gordon Sasaki reached out to Gwenn and asked for her help to compile all these interviews that you heard today. Thank you. That's my part.
Thank you so much, Troy and Gwen. And we have actually from the chat, Dr. Barry Goy, who's the current president of the Japanese American Medical Association. Dr. Goy, do you want to go off mute and just say a few words? Can you unmute yourself, Dr. Goy?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so JAMA's working on getting the book republished. It's been out of print for quite some time. And we've been working through JANM to get it republished, but we've encountered some roadblocks. But I'm really hoping this year would be the year. And the last message I got from JANM is that they will put another cover on the book. We don't know which picture they will put, but the new publisher does not want the old one. So I'm hoping that I can give that to you sometime this year, because if you look on Amazon, the price is about $175 for a copy when I last checked. And of course, we don't want to lose this important work that was published by Gwenn Jensen and Naomi Hirahara. And if you would be able to send me your email, I can put my email in the chat as well. I would appreciate it. And if there's a book signing, we'll let you know about it. And maybe we can have you there. That would be great.
Great, thank you so much. And we will keep folks informed through NCAPIP as well when that happens, so that people can follow up. So we have a couple of questions. First, let me start with a more technical medical clinical question from Christina Fa, which was, there was the reference that tuberculosis was an issue. So Gwenn, do you want to say a little bit about how tuberculosis actually, fortunately, didn't become as much of an issue as was feared? And then there's a follow-up question after that. So can you talk a little bit about tuberculosis first?
Well, tuberculosis was common in the Japanese American community before the war. And so I think Troy's grandfather caught it just before and wasn't able to be, he spent the war in a sanitarium. And Troy may know more about TB than I do, but all of the camps had TB patients, and there is a stigma in the Japanese American community against tuberculosis. And so doctors and nurses didn't want to treat some of the patients, but eventually they were able to get adequate care, and they started moving some of the patients to the Colorado camp, Amachi, because it's supposed to be, the high mountain air was supposed to be good for treatment. The main treatment was rest at the time, basically, and they kept them in special wards at the camp hospitals, and tried to keep them isolated from the rest of the community so they wouldn't pass it around, and that seemed to be fairly successful.
Great. And so a follow-up question, which I will embellish a little bit. You talked a lot about, Gwenn, that because this was under a military operation, that they weren't used to women and children and older adults, because they were used to treating draft age and men who were in the military at the time. Women were not permitted. So was there any involvement of the health facilities and the physicians in the camps in terms of when the oath was asked for and then people were actually drafted out of the camps? Were they also involved in doing any physical exams as some of the men started volunteering for the 42nd and the other regiments that they eventually fought in? Do you know that?
I don't think they were examined before they left camp, but they did volunteer from the camps, most of them. Several of the doctors volunteered, and they were sent. And then it turned out there was too many doctors in the segregated 442, so that some of them were sent to all white units in the ward because they had just too many doctors of Japanese American heritage.
So another question, I don't know whether Winston, you know the answer to this, is when the California Medical Association may have had policies of discrimination. Clearly, these Japanese American physicians that were practicing in California were licensed by the California Medical Board, but do we know whether they were excluded from the California Medical Association in the same way that others?
I could jump in here. So every year or every few years, the American Medical Association and the California Medical Association published a directory. And those who were members were in bold type. So some of the physicians were members, and some even attended the meetings, like Dr. Hatsuji Hara was one of the big AMA members. So anyway, it was, I don't know how exactly obstructive it was, but some were members. So
Just to
And
follow
then-
up on that, Troy, and Ignatius, for those of us who aren't in organized medicine, are not familiar with state associations and the National American Medical Association, part of this is that the medical groups or physicians would organize at the county level and then become a chapter of the larger California State Medical Association. So I think it's very geographically kind of manifested. And by corollary, the manifestation of racism at a county level starts to build up at the state level and at the national level. That's an important lesson to take here, because we sometimes extract this to think, well, we don't have discrimination in our place, but in fact, it manifests itself at a very localized and regional level, and therefore we need to always be on guard around protecting the rights of our professionals as well as the larger community, of course.
about Dr. Hara, I should say he was an Adventist, and the Adventists were unusual. They appointed him a faculty member, and they're very accepting of Japanese physicians there. So that might have been an outlier.
And obviously the Adventists then were the allies as the neighbor hospital that took the temporary custody of the Japanese hospital. So what also struck me in all these stories was the prominence of women as physicians. And again, we have to remember this is the 1940s. And Gwen, you referenced that Dr. Kazuo Tokusaki was actually one of the first Japanese American women to gain a medical license in California. Did you want to say more about the role of women and obviously how they may have worked with their male counterparts, and obviously the double layers of discrimination then, not only from the white supervising doctors, but who were, I presume, largely white men as well?
Well, to begin with, they faced a double whammy when they went to medical school in California. They took two slots. They took a male slot, a Japanese American slot or an Asian slot, and they took a female slot. And so they actually had the odds against them of getting into medical school. So that was number one. And Dr. Oda, who had started at UC Berkeley, her med school, she had graduated from UCLA in bacteriology, and she had planned to be a bacteriologist. And her professor would not write her a recommendation for grad school to go get her master's. So then she said, well, then I'll be a doctor. And she actually, she said she talked to her mom and said, I'll be a nurse. And her mom said, no. Nurses have to answer bedpans. Your aunt in Japan just had a terrible life. And so she became a doctor. She wanted to be a doctor. But he wouldn't write a recommendation for med school either. But she found a woman professor there who did and got her into med school. So that they had problems that way of getting into school. And most of them practiced individually in practices and were pretty strong-willed women. And I know Togasaki's, the three sisters who were physicians were very strong-willed. And Kazue and Yoshii, who Troy has interviewed before she passed away, they were actually kicked out of Manzanar. They said, you know, you're not following the rules. And so they decided, well, they can't do anything good there. They decided to go back and do residencies on the East Coast until the war ended. Troy, you can tell something about Yoshi. And
one of the stories she is, I don't know, I think it was Main Hospital, is she would write up the orders, you know, do the morning rounds, write the physician's orders. Caucasian administrator or physician would come by, cross them all out, write new orders. And then the nurses would tell her when he was gone. And she would come back and rewrite all the orders again. Just that daily annoyance, every day going on like that. Then she originally wanted to be in the same facility with her family. And of course, they split them up into 3 facilities at least: Topaz, Manzanar, and Tule Lake. You know, there's one thing I'm going to add that even goes way back before is her sister Kazue. Do you remember the San Francisco school crisis in 1905, where they wanted to enforce the separate but equal and get these Japanese students out of the grammar schools in San Francisco and push them into the Oriental school? Kazue was one of those kids. So even from the get-go, she gets pushed out of her neighborhood school, has to go to this Oriental school. So their family was very, very dedicated and tenacious.
And pushed back.
And pushed back. And after the war, what Yoshia did was she went to Europe and served in the resettlement of refugees under, I don't know if it's the army or who was doing that at the time. So
there's a captain in the army.
Went from one situation of displaced people to help other displaced people. Then she ended up being in maternal child medicine at Contra Costa County. So always spent in public service.
So it feels like we could keep sharing stories for a long time. There was one final comment about how others can bring this kind of research to light. We hope that this has sparked some interest in those of you who have attended. There is a lot of great material, obviously, from Gwenn's book, but also in the archives of the Japanese American National Museum from other sources. So there is some historical records. Troy obviously has done his own research and work into this. And so it would be great to see more interest and more publication to highlight this topic as it is so timely today. But I want to turn back to Dr. Wong for some closing remarks.
Well, first off, I want to thank Dr. Jensen and Dr. Kaji for, you know, sharing these really important, touching and distressing stories, but also about celebrating the heroism of these great individuals that dedicated their lives to their patients in their community. And I think it's so suiting, you know, during API Heritage Month that we take a pause to really salute these individuals. And again, I want to thank the Japanese American Medical Association and Dr. Goi for extending their leadership in this regard. One thing I want to mention is today, 20% of the physicians in the United States identify themselves as having Asian descent. It's almost like if you're in medicine, it's ubiquitous that you see Asian faces as being physicians, men and women, obviously. But there's a narrative that goes there that, you know, Asian Americans have made their place in American medicine. As the story is told here today, that's not the real narrative that goes across 100, 120 years ago. From what I understood, there were 97 physicians that were part of the internment of Japanese descent Nikkei physicians. Today, as I said, 20% of Asian descent. If you work out the math, 400,000 or so physicians in the United States, maybe 80,000 physicians of Asian descent now. So the numbers obviously belie what was the story 80 years ago. And by the way, Chinese Americans had hardly a dent in the profession of medicine, even in 1941, because they had yet been accepted as U.S. citizens because they were effectively barred from coming to the United States until 1962. So, this is the story, which I want to emphasize. Ignatius said, there's a lot of work to be done here. I want to speak directly to our young people of Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian descent who might be in medicine or nursing school. I would urge you to look at this history and do some of the research and make these stories relevant to your experience today in terms of how we as physicians take into account our ancestors' struggle as well as the forces of organized medicine, government that we had to overcome to face what was our just opportunity. I want to also thank the AMA Foundation that made this webinar possible. We really very much value their technical support as well as their financial support for this effort. And that is really an important acknowledgement in terms of how we continue to struggle forward in terms of looking at a more just and equitable healthcare system. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. And this is being recorded, so please share accordingly. And there may be some other opportunities for you to derive some benefit from this particular webinar. Thanks, Ignatius. Thanks, Dr. Jensen. And thank you, Dr. Kaji. And thank you to the Nikkei physicians.